You can live your whole life for others, raise them, feed them, sacrifice for them only to be told, in the end, that you're just in the way. It happened on an ordinary evening, the kind of quiet Alaskan night when the wind wraps around the trees like a whisper, and the snow falls so softly you almost believe it means you no harm. I was in the kitchen of my son's house in Talkeetna, stirring a pot of stew that had simmered all afternoon. It was a small thing, but it made me feel useful, present, still part of something. I laid the table gently, careful not to make too much noise. Melissa doesn't like clinking dishes. She says it gives her a headache. Dinner was quiet. As usual, Emily, my granddaughter, was humming to herself while nibbling on her bread. Brian scrolled on his phone. Melissa, across from me, pushed her green beans around with the side of her fork, and then she said it, without looking up, without flinching. You know, Carol, you eat, but you don't really help. It wasn't loud, it wasn't cruel in tone, but it sliced through me sharper than any yell. I looked at her, then at Brian, my son, my only child, the boy I had held through fevers, cheered on at school plays, and worked overtime shifts for when he needed new cleats. He said nothing, just kept chewing, his eyes still fixed on whatever meaningless screen glowed in his hand. I felt something inside me begin to curl in on itself, a tight, painful pull that started in my chest and moved up to my throat. But I didn't say a word, didn't cry, didn't argue. I simply nodded, set my spoon down, and folded my napkin slowly, deliberately. Emily looked up. Her big brown eyes, so much like Brian's when he was young, were filled with confusion. "Grandma," she whispered. I smiled at her, not because I felt like smiling, but because I didn't want her to carry my hurt. After dinner, I cleared the dishes without being asked. Melissa had already gone upstairs, and Brian sat on the couch, flipping channels like nothing had happened. I washed each plate with hands that had once carried him through scraped knees and heartbreaks, hands that had built a home, wiped tears, and comforted my dying husband. And now, apparently, they didn't help anymore. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the water stains on the ceiling of the small room they let me use. It had once been a storage closet, barely big enough to turn around in. My knees ached, my back throbbed, but the real pain, the kind you can't rub ointment on, was deeper. It was the realization that I was no longer seen as family, just someone who ate. They hadn't always been like this. When Frank, my husband, passed away 8 years earlier, Brian had insisted I come live with them. It'll be easier for everyone. He said, "You won't have to be alone, and Emily will love having you around." I wanted to believe him. So I sold the house Frank and I had built together back in Anchorage, the one with the creaky porch and the rose bush that bloomed like clockwork every June. I handed over most of the money, $84,000, to help with the new mortgage. Melissa said it would make everything more equitable. I didn't argue. I packed up decades of memories into 10 boxes and moved into their new home in Talkeetna, believing I still had a place, believing I still had worth. At first, it wasn't so bad. I cooked most meals, helped fold laundry, kept Emily entertained while they worked. I even paid the electric bill for the first few months without telling anyone. I just wanted to contribute, to show them I still mattered. But slowly, the smiles grew shorter, the conversations faded. Melissa began sighing whenever I walked into the room. Brian stopped asking how I was sleeping. And eventually, I stopped offering to help because I could feel, in every cold glance and awkward silence, that my presence had become a burden. Still, I stayed. I told myself it was just stress, that I was imagining things, that things would get better. Until that night, until that sentence, "You eat, but you don't help." That's when something inside me broke, but in the way a caged bird's heart breaks when the door is finally opened. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to ask a dangerous question. What if I left? What if I stopped waiting to be appreciated? What if I just walked out that night after Melissa's words had settled like frost in my chest? I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling of the small room they let me sleep in. It used to be a storage closet tucked near the back of the house, with just enough space for a twin bed, a nightstand, and the folded memories I carried in silence. My hands rested on my stomach, aching from arthritis and too many hours at the sink. But what hurt most was what couldn't be seen, that hollow, silent ache you feel when you finally realize you're not part of the family anymore. You're just someone they let stay. My name is Carol White, and I'm 73 years old, but I didn't always feel invisible. I was born Carol Higgins in a small fishing town near Kenai in 1952. My parents ran a tackle shop and spent most of their lives waist-deep in debt and fish scales. We didn't have much, but we had rhythm supper at 6 Church on Sundays and chores before school. I learned early on that love wasn't loud. It was folded laundry, warm soup, a hand on the back after a long day. I met Frank White at a county fair when I was 21. He was fixing a busted cotton candy machine, grease on his cheek, a lopsided smile on his face. He asked me if I wanted a free bag for being the prettiest girl in the whole crowd. I blushed so hard I nearly dropped it. We married 6 months later, bought a modest home in Anchorage, and built a life brick by brick. He opened a small engine repair shop. I worked as an elementary school teacher. We weren't rich, but we were steady. We had routines and quiet joys, a cup of coffee before sunrise, crossword puzzles on Sundays, planting tulips every spring. When Brian was born in 1979, my whole world shifted. I was already in my late 20s, and after 2 miscarriages, I didn't dare believe he'd really come, but he did, squirmy and red-faced, with lungs that could shatter windows. I remember holding him for the first time, thinking, whatever this child needs, I will give, and I did. I gave up nights, weekends, birthday parties. My job when he was 5 and sick, more often than not. I cooked from scratch, sewed Halloween costumes, saved every report card and macaroni necklace. I went without so he wouldn't have to. Frank used to joke, "You love that boy like he hung the moon," and maybe I did. When Brian was 18, he left for college in Fairbanks. I cried for a week, then mailed him care packages every month. When he got married to Melissa in his late 20s, I smiled through the whole wedding, even though she barely looked at me. I thought, give it time, she'll warm up. She never did. Frank passed 8 years ago, just before our 46th anniversary. Liver cancer. It moved fast and cruel. One minute he was joking with the hospice nurse about her awful coffee, and the next, he wasn't. I remember lying in bed next to him the night before he passed. He reached for my hand, thin and trembling, and said, "You're still my girl. Carol, don't let the world make you small." But I did. After the funeral, Brian insisted I move in. "Mom, you can't be alone in that big house." He said, "It's too much for you. Come live with us. It'll be good for everyone." I wanted to believe him. I sold the house. The home Frank and I had built from the ground up, the kitchen where I taught Brian how to crack eggs, the porch swing where Frank and I had sipped coffee and watched the sun crawl over the Chugach Mountains. I sold everything and gave Brian most of the money, $84,000, so he and Melissa could upgrade to a bigger home in Talkeetna. "It'll be your home too," Melissa had said, but her tone had already closed the door. I moved in with one suitcase, a few photo albums, my sewing kit, and a box of recipe cards written in my mother's handwriting. I told myself I'd be helpful, watch Emily, cook meals, do laundry. That's what mothers do, even when their backs are bent and their hearts a little worn. At first, I thought it might work. Emily loved spending time with me, and Brian seemed relieved to have another pair of hands around. I made pot roasts, patched torn coats, kept my voice down when Melissa was on work calls. I even paid the electric bill the first winter when I noticed it hadn't been covered. But little by little, the house shifted around me. Melissa started complaining that the food was too heavy. Brian stopped including me in conversations. Emily, once eager to show me her drawings, became more distant, too distracted, maybe, or just picking up on the undercurrents around her. Then came the silences, the closed doors, the sighs when I entered the room, and finally, the sentence that made everything crystal clear. "You eat, but you don't help." I had helped, for decades, in more ways than anyone would ever know. But in that moment, none of it mattered. Not the years, not the money, not the love. I was no longer seen as someone who built a family, but as someone who burdened it. That night, in that cold little room, I thought about all the women I'd known over the years who ended up fading into the wallpaper of their children's homes. Good women, strong women. Women who gave until there was nothing left. I realized I'd become one of them. And suddenly, I didn't want to disappear quietly. I didn't want to wait for permission to be seen again. I wanted more. I didn't know where I'd go. I had very little money, no home of my own, and a body that didn't move like it used to. But I had one thing left, the will to reclaim the parts of me I'd buried to keep others comfortable. And so, with trembling hands and a heart both broken and awakening, I began to plan my escape not out of anger, but out of something far more powerful, hope. The snow had stopped sometime after midnight. I knew because I watched it fall for hours. The street lamp outside casting a soft orange glow as flakes tumbled down like quiet prayers. By 5 a.m., I was dressed, 2 sweaters under my coat, thick socks inside my worn boots. I packed light, just one small duffel, a few warm clothes, my sewing kit, a small notebook of recipes I couldn't bear to leave behind, and a photo of Frank creased and faded from years tucked inside my Bible. I left a note on the kitchen counter. "Thank you for letting me stay. I won't be a burden any longer. Please don't come looking." I didn't know if Brian would read it with guilt, anger, or relief, maybe all three. But I wasn't writing it for him. I was writing it for me to mark the moment I chose myself for the first time in years. The wind stung my face as I stepped outside. The snow crunched underfoot, each step cutting a path that no one would follow. The world was still dark, but there was something strangely comforting in that, like I could disappear without fanfare, just a shadow reclaiming its shape. Talkeetna's town bus came at 6:20 from the general store. I knew the schedule by heart, though I'd never ridden it. I kept my head down and made the 15-minute walk in silence, hoping I wouldn't run into anyone who recognized me. The driver, a man in his 60s with a wool cap and kind eyes, looked surprised when I boarded. "Mornin', ma'am." Heading into Wasilla, I nodded. too afraid my voice would tremble if I spoke. He didn't ask questions, just tipped his head and motioned me to sit. As we drove, the trees passed by in streaks of white and green. I leaned my head against the window and closed my eyes. For the first time in years, there was no hum of dishes behind me, no sharp voices from upstairs, no footsteps approaching to ask where something was, just quiet and freedom. When we reached Wasilla, I stepped off the bus and stood on the sidewalk, suddenly unsure of what to do next. I had no plan, no apartment waiting, no friend to greet me, just a bag, a coat, and 73 years of experience in surviving what I thought I couldn't. I walked to a small diner I remembered from years ago. It was still there, barely holding together, but open. The smell of bacon and coffee pulled me inside like a magnet. The waitress, a short woman with silver braids and laugh lines, greeted me with a tired smile. "Coffee, please," I said softly, my voice scratchy from the cold. She poured me a cup and brought over a plate of eggs and toast without asking. "You look like someone who needs warmth." I blinked fast, not because I was sad, but because she saw me. She saw me. After eating, I asked if she knew a place I could rent cheap for a few nights. She pointed me to a flyer on the bulletin board near the door. Cabin rentals off Willow Creek Road. Nothing fancy, but clean. "Tell them Shirley sent you." I thanked her, grabbed my bag, and walked the mile to the cabin listings address. The owner was a quiet man named Hank, who offered me a seasonal worker's rate when I told him I didn't have much. "No heat in the bedroom," he warned, "but the main room's fine if you keep the stove going." It didn't matter. That tiny cabin, with its chipped floorboards and single window, felt more like home than any place I'd lived in years. I sat on the narrow cot that first night, wrapped in my coat, staring at the blank wall and letting it wash over me. I was on my own. No safety net, no dinner waiting, no voice in the other room. But for the first time, I could breathe. In the morning, I made tea from a few packets Shirley had stuffed into my coat pocket. I stood on the porch and watched the sun rise through the trees. And in that golden light, I whispered something I hadn't said aloud in years. I'm still here, not just alive, but present. My hands were sore. My bank account was almost empty, and the road ahead was uncertain. But that morning, I felt something I hadn't felt in so long. I felt myself again. And that, I decided, was a beginning. It was a Tuesday when I found the box of old jars behind the cabin's kitchenette. They were tucked away beneath the counter, coated in dust and sticky with age. But they were intact, no cracks, just a little forgotten, like me. I picked one up and ran my finger along the rim. The cool glass felt familiar in my hands. A memory sparked of summer mornings back in Anchorage, Frank, out in the yard with his radio. Brian chasing fireflies, and me in the kitchen boiling strawberries for jam. We never had much, but I made our pantry feel rich with rows of preserves, applesauce, even pickled carrots. Back then, I made jam because it was practical. Now, it felt like something else entirely. I walked into town later that morning with my scarf wrapped tight and my notebook tucked under my arm. I found a small market and used my last few bills to buy sugar, lemons, and a bag of frozen blueberries. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Back at the cabin, I boiled water, washed the jars, and cleared a space on the tiny counter. The stove hissed and clicked as it came to life, and as I stirred the fruit and sugar, the scent filled the room like an old friend walking through the door. Blueberries, lemon zest, and just a pinch of cinnamon, my own little signature from years ago. As it cooked down, I hummed to myself without even realizing it, something soft and familiar. I hadn't hummed in years, not in that house, not around Melissa's sighs and Brian's silences. I'd forgotten how much I missed the sound of my own happiness. When the jam was ready, I ladled it carefully into 3 jars and sealed them tight. I let them cool on the windowsill, the lids popping quietly as they set. I stood there watching them, arms crossed, the cold outside forgotten. 3 small jars, but to me, they were proof that my hands still had purpose, that I could still make something from almost nothing, that I was still me. The next morning, I brought 1 jar into town as a thank you for Shirley at the diner. She raised her eyebrows when I handed it to her. "Did you make this?" I nodded, suddenly shy. I used to, a long time ago. She opened it right then and there, dipped the handle of a clean spoon into the jar, and tasted it. Her eyes closed for a second. "Carol," she said, "this is good, like really good." I smiled, a real smile, the kind that didn't feel borrowed or polite. She asked if I had more. I told her not yet, but I could make more. She sent me home with a bag of leftover fruit from the kitchen: apples, overripe pears, some soft cranberries, and I got to work. Every day that week, I made something: a pear ginger spread, apple butter with nutmeg, cranberry orange preserves. Each night, I filled jars and labeled them by hand with masking tape and a ballpoint pen. Carol's Cabin Kitchen, I wrote, just to amuse myself. I brought them back to Shirley, who put them on a shelf near the register with a little handwritten sign made by Carol, the sweetest soul in Wasilla. By the end of the week, they'd all sold. The next Saturday, she invited me to set up a small table outside the diner. "People around here love homemade things," she said, "especially when it tastes like something their mothers made." I didn't even hesitate. That morning, I packed a small box of jars into my duffel, wrapped a scarf around my neck, and stood in front of that diner like I had something worth sharing. Because I did. People stopped. They smiled. They tasted. Some even told me stories about their own grandmothers, about jam sandwiches in lunchboxes, about canning with their mothers when they were small. They weren't just buying jam. They were remembering, and so was I. I used to think community was something you had to be born into or married into or fight your whole life to keep, but I was wrong. Sometimes, the best kind of belonging is the one you don't see coming at all. After that first Saturday at the diner, things started moving faster than I was ready for. Shirley gave me a permanent spot near the front window. "You've got something special," she kept saying, her hand resting on my shoulder. "People don't just come for the jam, Carol. They come because it reminds them of something they lost." I wasn't sure what to say to that. I wasn't used to people listening, let alone seeing me as someone worth gathering around. But Shirley didn't let me shrink away. She started introducing me to others in town. One of them was Darlene, a tall, sharp-tongued woman in her late 60s who ran the local thrift shop. The first thing she said to me was, "You knit?" I blinked. Not since my hands got stiff. Why? Because our Thursday craft group needs another pair of hands and a mouth. We talk more than we stitch. I almost said no. My instinct was still to keep to myself, to stay out of the way. But then I remembered the look in Emily's eyes the last time she hugged me goodbye, a mix of love and distance, the ache I'd carried ever since. And I realized I didn't want to be alone anymore. So I said yes, that Thursday. I walked into the community center, not knowing what to expect. The building was small, low-ceilinged, with linoleum floors and the smell of old coffee and pine-scented cleaner. Inside, 7 women sat around a long folding table, laughing over something I had missed. Carol Darlene called, "Come sit. We've got tea, lemon bars, and too many opinions." They made space for me, literally and emotionally. No questions about where I came from. No pressure to explain what had happened or why my voice was so quiet. They just welcomed me like I'd been showing up for years. There was Marge, who crocheted potholders for every holiday and told stories about her 5 grandkids like they were royalty. June, a retired nurse who baked like she was competing in the county fair every week. And Edith, who couldn't see well anymore, but came just to feel the yarn in her hands and hum old gospel songs under her breath. I didn't realize how much I had missed this being part of something simple, something warm. I brought a jar of cranberry apple butter with me that first day. When I opened it, the women nearly cleaned it out in minutes. "You ever think of selling this at the Saturday market?" June asked, licking her spoon. I smiled. "I already do." "A little." "Well," Darlene said, folding her arms, "it's not little anymore. We're going to help you make it big." And they did. The next week, June helped me sew a new table runner. Marge brought a basket she'd woven herself to hold my jars. Edith's granddaughter offered to help set up a little social media page. And before I knew it, I wasn't just making jam. I was building something that felt like mine. Word spread. The market booth became a regular stop for tourists and locals alike. People started calling me the Jam Lady, and for the first time in years, I liked the sound of a label. It meant I was doing something, creating, contributing. One afternoon, a woman I didn't recognize came to my table. Her coat was worn, her shoulders hunched like she'd been carrying too much for too long. "I heard you started over," she said quietly, "after your family pushed you out." My hands paused mid-label. I did. She looked down, her voice trembling. "I think I need to start over too, but I don't know how." I took her hand cold, thin, shaking, and said, "You don't have to know how. You just have to take one step." She cried right there in front of me, and I let her, because I had cried too, just not in front of anyone. That night, I sat in the cabin with the fire crackling and my sewing kit in my lap. I looked around at the shelves, lined with labeled jars, the framed photo of Frank on the mantel, and the soft scarf June had knitted for me on the back of my chair. This little space, once so bare and silent, now felt full of color, full of warmth, full of me, the woman I used to be, the wife, the mother, the invisible helper. She still lived inside me, but now she shared space with someone stronger, someone braver, someone who chose herself, even when it meant walking into the unknown with nothing but a duffel bag and a few recipes in her hand. I never imagined I'd start over at 73, but here I was starting over, and finally, I wasn't doing it alone. It was a gray morning when I heard the knock, the kind of day when the clouds hang low and everything feels like it's holding its breath. I was labeling a fresh batch of pear vanilla preserves when the sound came 3 soft knocks, hesitant, like someone unsure whether they even had the right door. Nobody ever knocked on my cabin. The market ladies just walked in with pyre yarn. The postman left packages near the porch. Even Darlene, who respected privacy like it was a religion, only ever waved from her car. But this knock, it felt different, familiar. I wiped my hands on my apron, walked to the door, and opened it. And there he was, Brian, He looked older than I remembered, or maybe just more tired. His eyes had shadows I didn't recognize, and his once dark hair was now dusted with gray. He wasn't wearing gloves, and his cheeks were pink from the cold. "Hi, Mom," he said quietly. I didn't speak. I didn't know how. My breath caught in my throat, like the space between us had grown too wide to cross in one greeting. "I didn't know if you'd open the door," he added, almost smiling. "I wasn't even sure you still lived here. Someone in town pointed me this way." I stepped aside slowly, not because I had forgiven him, but because I wanted to hear why he came. He walked in, glancing around the small cabin. His eyes landed on the jars, the hand-stitched curtains, the picture of Frank on the shelf. He nodded as if he had entered a room from a dream he didn't think was real. "You made all this?" he asked. I nodded. With help from some kind people, he sat down at the table without being asked, like it was still his right, like time hadn't passed. "I'm not here to make excuses," he began. "I know what we did, what I let happen was wrong." My heart beat slow and heavy in my chest. I wanted to say so many things, that he broke my trust, that he let Melissa treat me like a piece of old furniture, that he took my money and my dignity and never once looked back. But I said nothing. I waited. "Melissa's gone," he said after a pause. "She left about 3 months ago, took Emily and moved to Oregon. I don't blame her, not entirely. I was never really present. I worked too much. I avoided the hard stuff." I raised an eyebrow. "And what made you think of me now?" He looked down at his hands. "I found your note," he said, "the one you left that night. I kept it. I read it again last week, and for the first time, I really read it." I sat across from him, resting my tired hands on the table. "So what are you hoping for, Brian?" He sighed. "Honestly, I don't know. Maybe just a chance to say I'm sorry, to tell you that I miss you, that I wish I'd seen what was happening before it was too late." I felt the warmth of the stove behind me, the gentle clinking of jars cooling on the counter. This was my world now, a world I had built from scraps of pain and stubborn hope. And here was my son, once the center of my universe, sitting across from me as a stranger with familiar eyes. I reached for the teapot and poured us each a cup of chamomile. No sugar, just warmth. "I don't hate you," I said finally, "but I can't come back to that life. Not ever." He nodded. "I didn't expect you to. I just wanted you to know. I see it now. What you did, what I let happen. I should have stood up for you." There it was. The apology I never thought I'd hear. It didn't erase the pain, but it let me breathe easier. Before he left, he pulled a small envelope from his coat and slid it across the table. "It's not everything," he said, "but it's what I could put together. I know it doesn't make up for what we took, but maybe it helps." I didn't open it. I just looked at him and said, "You want to make it right. Stay in Emily's life. Be better for her. Let her see you do something different." He nodded, eyes glassy. Then he stood, took one last look around my little cabin, and walked out into the cold. I didn't cry. I didn't crumble. I sat by the window, sipping my tea, watching him disappear down the snowy path. And for the first time since I left that house, I realized something powerful. Closure doesn't come from others. It comes when we stop needing permission to move on. After Brian left, the silence in my cabin felt different. It wasn't empty. It was settled, like the air no longer carried the weight of unsaid things. I didn't feel angry or triumphant or even proud. I just felt still, and in that stillness, I realized something important. I hadn't been waiting for an apology. I'd been waiting to feel whole again, and I already was. The days after that were quiet but purposeful. I kept my routines: morning tea, firewood check, and hours at the counter stirring pots of jam. But something inside me had changed. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living. I started experimenting with new flavors: rhubarb maple, strawberry with cracked pepper, peach with a hint of basil. Word spread beyond our little market. A woman from Anchorage reached out asking if I'd consider selling wholesale for her boutique grocery. I didn't even know what to charge at first. I'd never thought of myself as a businesswoman. I called Darlene. She came over with her reading glasses, a yellow legal pad, and 3 thick books on starting a home-based food business. "You're not just making jam," she said, tapping the counter with her pencil. "You're building something real." The next week, I officially registered Carol's Cabin Kitchen. I got a permit. June's niece helped me build a proper website. Edith's grandson designed a little logo, an outline of a mason jar wrapped in a scarf, with steam rising from the lid. When I saw that logo printed on a label for the first time, I cried, quietly, into a dish towel. Not because I was sad, but because something I made was now out in the world, carrying my name, my story, my hands. One Saturday at the market, a woman named Nancy stopped at my booth. She looked about my age, her gray hair pinned neatly back, her expression tight like she was holding her breath. She didn't say anything at first, just stared at the jars like she wasn't sure if she should be there. "Would you like a sample?" I asked, gently holding out a wooden spoon. She hesitated, then nodded. She tasted the spiced plum, closed her eyes, then opened them again and whispered, "My mother used to make this." We stood in silence. Then she said something that stayed with me. "I've been staying with my son and his wife for 2 years. I thought I was doing the right thing, helping them with the baby. But last week, my daughter-in-law called me extra weight. I didn't ask for more. She didn't need to explain. I just handed her a second spoon and said, 'I understand.' She came back the next weekend, and the weekend after that. Eventually, she started helping me set up. Darlene gave her a part-time job at the thrift shop, and not long after, she brought a box of her own, filled with hand-stitched tea towels. 'Think anyone might buy these?' she asked. 'They will if you believe they're worth something,' I told her. That's when it hit me. My booth had become more than a business. It was a door, a quiet, unassuming doorway into a place where women could start over without shame. Darlene and I talked about it over coffee one Sunday afternoon. "What if we opened a space," she asked, "not just a booth, a real place, where women could sell things. They made jams, quilts, candles, whatever, a place where no one tells them they're too old or too late." My heart leapt. "I know the perfect name." I said, "Second Light," because that's what we all were, women who thought the sun had set on us, only to realize there was still another kind of light waiting, one born not from youth, but from resilience, not from approval, but from self-worth. We pitched the idea to the community board. June baked cookies for the meeting. Edith, bless her, brought everyone to tears with a short poem she wrote about starting over at 80. Within a month, we had a donated space, a cozy storefront with creaky floors, a fireplace, and enough shelves for everyone's work. The grand opening of Second Light brought in more people than the Harvest Festival. Folks from all over came to browse, sip cider, and listened to our stories. We didn't sell out of everything, but we sold enough to believe this little miracle of ours could grow. And in the middle of it all, I stood behind my table, my name printed in soft script beneath each jar, and watched as women found themselves again. They weren't just buying jam. They were tasting proof that life could begin again. So was I. It arrived on a breezy afternoon in early spring, tucked beneath the flower pot beside my front steps, sealed in a light blue envelope. I knew that handwriting. It was Emily's. My hands trembled as I opened it. Breath caught somewhere between hope and fear. I hadn't seen her in nearly 2 years. Not since the day I left Brian's house. Not since she stood on the landing, eyes wide and confused, watching her grandmother disappear into the snow without a goodbye. But now, her words came like sunlight. Dear Grandma, Mom said it was okay to write. I wanted to for a long time. I just didn't know what to say. I miss you. I miss your jam. I miss your stories and your warm hands. I didn't understand why you left at first. I thought maybe it was my fault. But now I know sometimes people leave because they need to find themselves again. I hope you're happy. I hope your little house is warm and your shelves are full. If it's okay, I'd really like to visit you this summer. Love, Emily. I pressed the paper to my chest and let the tears fall freely. Not out of sadness, but out of release. She remembered me, not as a burden, not as extra weight, but as someone who made jam, told stories, gave warmth. That was all I ever wanted. That's all any of us want, to be remembered for the love we leave behind, not the mistakes others placed on us. That night, I wrote her back. I told her I had a jar of raspberry jam waiting on the shelf with her name on it. I told her about Second Light, about the friends she'd love to meet, and how my little cabin still smelled like cinnamon and orange peel. And I told her the truth that I was still healing, but I was no longer hiding. If there's one thing I've learned on this long, winding road through motherhood, widowhood, and womanhood, it's this. You are allowed to start over at 73, at 83, at any age. You are allowed to leave places where your soul feels invisible. You are allowed to build something from the scraps others thought were useless. And you are allowed to be seen not just as a mother or a helper or a quiet shadow, but as you. You are never too old to matter. You are never too late to rise. And you are never, ever too far gone to come home to yourself. If this story spoke to you, if you've ever felt pushed aside, erased, or forgotten, please share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us where you found your second light, or where you hope to find it. And if you believe in stories like Carol's stories of strength, rebirth, and quiet power, subscribe to the channel. You never know. The next story might just be yours.